What if I told you that Cinderella was never meant to be a fairy tale, that beneath the shimmering ball gowns and glittering slippers, there lies a ritual older than kingdoms, older than written history itself. 5,000 years ago, long before Europe dressed the story in lace and silk, cultures across the world whispered the same haunting pattern: a young woman marked by ash and humiliation, chosen not by chance but by trial, her fate sealed by a single shoe. Fairy tale, or a survival of something far darker. We know the story by heart. A girl crushed beneath the cruelty of her stepmother and stepsisters, forgotten and buried in the ashes. A midnight miracle, a dress of silver, a carriage born from a pumpkin, servants from mice. The grand ball, the enamored prince, the clock striking 12. And of course, the slipper fragile and perfect that binds her fate forever. But listen closely. Does this sound like mere fantasy? Or like the echo of something ritualistic? The ashes she sleeps in. Why ashes? In ancient times, ash was not filth but a sacred residue of fire, a substance that clung to the skin of those who had passed through trial by flame. It marked both shame and transformation, death and rebirth. The glass slipper. Why a shoe? Across the ancient world, shoes were buried with women, tokens for the journey into another realm. In Egypt, in China, in Norse lands, footwear was never just clothing. It was a key, a proof, a seal of passage. Whoever could wear the shoe was not merely worthy, she was chosen, initiated, transformed. Even the ball itself, the glittering feast at the palace, does it not resemble the ritual gatherings where maidens were offered, displayed, judged? A night where beauty, fertility, and destiny were measured under the eyes of the powerful. And when the clock strikes midnight, the spell collapses, as if to remind us that no mortal can escape the cycle of time, that youth, beauty, and favor are fleeting, that a single step too late can return you to ashes forever. The story we tell our children as a dream of love may in truth be the memory of fire and sacrifice. A girl plucked from obscurity not because of kindness alone, but because her body, her presence, her shoe fit the ancient code. Think of it. Every culture tells its own version. In Egypt, Rhodopis, the slave girl, is chosen when her sandal is carried by an eagle and dropped before the pharaoh. In China, Yexian, dressed in rags, wins her fate through a golden slipper so small it binds her destiny. Even in Norse lands, brides were tested by the fitting of shoes, proof of their passage into womanhood. And in every tale, the pattern is the same. A girl of ashes, a shoe of fate, a night of judgment. 5,000 years, and still the story survives. Why? Because we have forgotten its origin. We call it a fairy tale. But once it was something else. A trial, a ritual, a secret buried in myth. But Cinderella's shadow does not belong to Europe alone. The story, or something like it, drifts across time and oceans, changing faces but keeping its bones. And if we follow those bones, we find they lead us deeper into temples, into tombs, into blood. In Egypt, more than 2,500 years ago, a tale was told of Rhodopis, a foreign slave. She was mocked, beaten, forced into toil, until the day her sandal was snatched by an eagle and dropped before the pharaoh himself. To him, it was no accident. The gods had spoken. He sought her, and when the sandal fit, she became queen. But listen carefully. The shoe is not chosen by her. It is torn from her, carried skyward, and placed into the hands of a king. Rhodopis does not walk toward destiny. Destiny seizes her. Her foot, her body, her life are bound by a shoe that becomes less a symbol of romance and more a seal of divine command. Archaeologists remind us that in Egyptian burials, shoes were more than clothing. They were tokens for the dead, guides for journeys across the underworld. What does it mean then when a pharaoh's queen is chosen by her sandal? Perhaps it means she was not simply bride, but sacrifice her role demanded, not requested. Centuries later, the tale drifts east to the courts of China. The year is 860. The girl is Yexian, orphaned, dressed in rags, gifted a single golden slipper by a spirit of the dead. Her stepsisters despise her, yet at the festival the slipper transforms her into something otherworldly. A king finds it, searches for her, binds her by its measure. But in China the shoe carries another weight. For centuries, young girls had their feet bound, broken, bent, crushed into shapes of pain. The smaller the foot, the greater the proof of purity, obedience, submission. To fit the golden slipper was not to be free, it was to be controlled. Yexian's story hides inside this ritual, echoing the same message: the shoe is not love, it is proof of ownership. Travel further north into the cold of Norse lands. There, the gods themselves demanded shoes as test and tribute. In one myth, the goddess Skadi chooses her husband not by face but by feet. Brides too were judged by the fit of shoes, proof that they were ready for union, ready to cross the threshold from maiden to wife. Yet beneath the laughter of sagas lies something darker: shoes placed upon the dead to guide them into the next world. The same ritual again, echoing across cultures: the foot, the shoe, the passage. Always a girl on the threshold, always a fate sealed by leather, by gold, by glass. So, what does this mean? It means that Cinderella is not just a European fairy tale polished by Perrault or softened by Disney. She is a survivor of a ritual that stretched across continents, reshaped by every culture it touched. In Egypt, she was Rhodopis, the slave bound by a sandal. In China, she was Ye Xian, the orphan bound by golden shoes and the cruelty of beauty. In the Norse north, she was every maiden tested, every corpse carried with shoes into the afterlife. The details shift: the eagle, the fish, the fairy godmother. But the bones never change. A girl in ashes, a shoe of fate, a test that binds her to powers greater than herself. And so, across thousands of years, the same symbols repeat. Ash marking trial, the shoe marking destiny, the gathering marking judgment. Why does the pattern survive? Why does every culture retell the same story in different clothes under different skies? Perhaps because what we call Cinderella was never meant to entertain. It was meant to warn. To remind every listener of the price demanded of women, of the blood behind beauty, of the fire beneath the ashes. And if every culture carries the same memory, then perhaps it is not memory at all, but truth. Beneath the glitter of the fairy tale, there are bones. Archaeologists brushing soil from stone and bone keep finding the same strange trace: shoes resting beside the dead. In tombs of ancient Egypt, sandals of reed and leather were laid at the feet of young women, not for comfort, but for passage. The soul needed shoes to walk into the underworld. The shoe was a token, a guide, a permission. To bury a girl with sandals was to admit she had been chosen, her steps no longer her own, but carried into another realm. In China, the graves of women tell another story. Tiny slippers, impossibly small, carved of gold or silk, pressed into the earth beside fragile bones. For centuries, foot binding crushed the bodies of young girls, reshaping them into what society called beauty, but what was in truth control. These shoes were not gifts, they were shackles made permanent. To fit them was to prove obedience. To wear them into the grave was to show that her body had been claimed in life and in death. Even in the frozen north, Viking burials echo the same pattern. Men and women alike were buried with shoes, as if to walk across the threshold to another world. Yet the symbolism falls heaviest on the young women. The shoe marks transition. Maiden to bride, bride to mother, woman to corpse. Each step guided each path, chosen not by her, but by the hands of ritual. The archaeologists give us fragments: shoes preserved in sand, leather hardened by time, silk decayed to threads. But when we piece them together, they form a haunting image. In many cultures, shoes were not about walking at all. They were about crossing. Crossing from childhood into adulthood, from fertility into marriage, from life into death. And this is where the shadow of Cinderella grows darker. The fairy tale tells us the shoe proved her identity, that she was worthy of the prince. But archaeology whispers another meaning. The shoe was a test, a ritual, a seal. It measured her body. It bound her destiny. It was never a symbol of freedom. It was the proof that she belonged to someone else. Think of the slipper again, delicate and impossible. In our hands, it looks like magic, but in the language of the past, it looks like control. A shoe so small it could only fit one. A shoe that demands the girl to match it perfectly or be cast aside. It is the same principle that ruled foot binding in China, the same trial that marked brides in Norse sagas. To fit the shoe was to surrender. To fail was to vanish. And the ashes. They too belong here. In ritual after ritual, ash was the residue of fire, the mark of transformation. To be covered in ash was to be neither alive nor dead, but in between, a girl awaiting passage. Cinderella is not chosen because she is good. She is chosen because she has already been marked, already crossed into the liminal space where sacrifice becomes possible. So perhaps the story we tell as a romance was once something else entirely. A memory of initiation rites where a girl was paraded before a crowd, tested, bound, offered. Not to find love, but to fulfill a demand older than love. Some scholars whisper that the slipper may hide the trace of a virgin sacrifice, a young woman offered in fire or in marriage, which in ancient times were not always so different. Both demanded purity. Both demanded obedience. Both transformed her body into something claimed by another. And so, archaeology does not dismiss the fairy tale, it sharpens it. It tells us that Cinderella may be a survivor of rituals in which women were bound by ash, by fire, by shoes too small to escape. A story not of magic, but of memory. Not of love, but of control. 5,000 years of tombs and slippers, bones and ashes. And still we tell the story to children as if it were gentle. But beneath every word lies the echo of the ritual, and the secret that the shoe was never meant for dancing, but for binding. The slipper lies at the heart of the tale. Delicate, fragile, impossible, made of glass or gold or silk, depending on which tongue tells the story. To the modern ear, it is a symbol of beauty, a token of romance. But beneath the surface, it is something else, a cage disguised as a jewel. In every version of the story, the shoe does not expand. It does not bend. It allows only one to enter. To fit the shoe is to be bound to prove that your body and your body alone matches the measure set by power. It is the trial by form, the ritual of restriction. In China, golden slippers and bound feet spoke of purity, of control, of obedience. In Norse lands, brides tested by shoes were not celebrated for choice but for submission. And in Egypt, sandals buried in tombs marked the passage of a woman's soul to the realm of the dead. So when Cinderella slips her foot into the slipper, it is not freedom she receives. It is destiny, sealed and inescapable. A ritual binding a shackle cloaked in the shimmer of fairy tale magic. The slipper is not love, it is power. It is the key that unlocks her new life, but also the lock that ensures she cannot step back. The ashes tell their own story. Cinder soot, black dust clinging to skin symbols we dismiss as filth, humiliation, suffering. Yet, in older times, ash was sacred. It marked the residue of fire, the threshold between life and death. Those covered in ash were not merely dirty. They were transformed. In funerary rites, ash signaled the end of one existence and the beginning of another. In initiation ceremonies, ash marked the initiate as liminal, suspended between two worlds. Cinderella's very name ties her to this substance. She is not a maiden of silk, but a daughter of ash, one who has endured fire and carried its mark. Her story is not about dirt washed away by magic, but about the truth that survival demands passing through flames. To wear ashes is to wear death itself and to be reborn from it. Even the pumpkin, the strange fruit chosen as her carriage, carries layers of meaning. It is not an accident. Pumpkins are fruits of harvest tied to the cycles of growth and decay. They swell with life in autumn just as the fields begin to wither. To carve them, to hollow them, is to mimic death, transformation, rebirth. In many cultures, gourds and pumpkins were used as vessels for food, for drink, for offerings, even for carrying the ashes of the dead. So when Cinderella rides to the ball inside a pumpkin-turned carriage, she does not simply arrive in style. She arrives within a coffin of fertility, a vessel of death and life combined. She is carried by the cycle of harvest itself, a reminder that her fate is tied to the endless rhythm of nature, bloom, decay, rebirth. And the ball, the glittering palace, the chandeliers, the crowd of nobles, what is it, if not ritual? A feast of display where maidens are paraded before the eyes of power. Beneath the music and silk, the ball is judgment. A transition rite where a girl passes from obscurity into visibility, from shadow into light. It is not freedom, it is exposure. Every step she takes across the floor is a test watched by eyes that measure her worth. The ball is the turning of the wheel, darkness to light, ashes to radiance, mortality to hope. But it is also a warning. For when the clock strikes midnight, the illusion shatters. The dress fades, the carriage rots, the magic collapses. Time devours all beauty. The girl returns to cinder. The ritual ends. Taken together, the symbols whisper the same truth. The shoe binds. The ash marks death and rebirth. The pumpkin carries the weight of harvest and decay. The ball is the threshold between shadow and light. Cinderella is not a tale of chance, but of transformation. She moves from one state to another, ash to bride shadow to spectacle maiden to sacrifice. Each symbol is a door, and each door demands a price. We tell the story to children as if it were gentle, but the symbols betray it. They whisper of rites older than memory, of bodies bound and burned, of cycles of death and rebirth. In the end, Cinderella does not merely win her happily ever after. She embodies the ritual itself, a girl marked by ash, bound by a shoe, carried in a vessel of harvest, judged beneath the eyes of the powerful. And every time the story is told, those symbols survive, reminders of fire, of blood, of the thin line between death and transformation. So, what then does Cinderella truly tell us? Not a dream of gowns and castles, not the promise of happily ever after. It whispers something harsher, older, that life itself is forged through fire, through ash, through trial. The tale survives not because of magic, but because it mirrors the cycle every soul must endure. We are cast down, broken, buried in soot. We endure humiliation, loss, the weight of cruelty. And only then, only through the ashes, do we emerge changed. The transformation is never free. It always demands pain. Cinderella's triumph is not the dress nor the slipper, nor even the prince. It is her survival. She endures the ashes without vanishing. She carries humiliation without being consumed. When the clock strikes midnight and the illusion collapses, she does not despair. She returns to cinder, and still she waits for the next trial. That is her strength. The philosophy buried here is clear. The world does not reward innocence with miracles. It does not hand out salvation for free. Instead, it demands passage through darkness. Fire must burn, time must devour, ash must cling, and only those who endure emerge transformed. Perhaps this is why the story survived 5,000 years retold under different skies. Not because it is sweet, but because it is true. Every culture, every listener knows the pattern. We suffer, we burn, we crumble, and yet somehow we rise. Even the symbols remind us of this truth. The shoe that binds the ash, that marks the pumpkin that rots and renews the ball that begins and ends with judgment. All are reminders that life is not gentle. It is ritual, it is trial, it is passage. And so Cinderella is not a fantasy of effortless happiness. She is a warning and a promise. Happiness, if it comes, will be carved from ash. Beauty, if it shines, will always be fleeting. Survival, if it matters, will depend not on magic, but on endurance. The story whispers, you will suffer, you will burn, you will be bound. But if you endure, if you step through the ashes, there may be light on the other side. Not happily ever after, but survival ever after. So we are left with a question. If Cinderella is not merely a dream, but a ritual disguised as a fairy tale, then what else have we forgotten? For 5,000 years, her story has carried the memory of fire, ash, and sacrifice. It has bound the feet of maidens from Egypt to China, from the frozen north to our own time. We tell it gently as if it were only romance, but beneath it lies the sound of crackling fire, the scent of burnt offerings, the silence of ritual halls where girls once stood trembling in ash. If Cinderella carries this secret buried in myth for millennia, what of the other tales we thought we knew? What of Snow White, whose beauty ends not in love but in a glass coffin? A coffin that does not protect but displays as if her body were an offering to gods we no longer name. What of the huntsman's knife, the poisoned apple, the lips red as blood? Perhaps those too are not innocent at all. Perhaps they are the remnants of rituals, even older, darker rituals of blood-spilled bodies, displayed maidens bound between life and death. And if Cinderella's slipper is a shackle, then Snow White's coffin may be a shrine.